the new Ant Biology webinar series presented to you by the Translational Outcomes Research Group of the Department of Zoology, University of Calcutta. This new series aims to celebrate the latest advances in the field of life science along with its relatedness to other disciplines. We shall be having 2 lectures every 2 weeks, with Saturday lectures on topics related to other disciplines and Sunday lectures on different topics of the life sciences. I am Shinjini and I will be your moderator for today's session. Before we begin, I would like to inform you that you can post your questions in the YouTube chat box and we shall moderate them at the end of the lecture. You are free to interact with each other and with the speaker. And if you have any questions or comments meant for the speaker or for us, feel free to email us and we shall address it to the best of our abilities. And you can also send us your feedback through the feedback link which will be provided in the chat box near the end of the session. So without any further delay, I would request our convener, Professor Inare Banerjee of the Department of Zoology, University of Calcutta, to introduce our new webinar series and to welcome our speaker, Professor Rajshekhar Basu of the University of Calcutta. Ma'am.
Thank you, Shinjini. A very good evening from Kolkata, India, to all our viewers who are with us live now, and to all the future viewers who will be doubtless tuning in to the archive talks in our YouTube channel. We had organized an earlier series, Progress and Prospects in Biology, which has ended on the 31st of January this year. And we are happy to announce that we are starting another new series with a slightly different philosophy, in the sense that we shall be celebrating biology not only from biologists, somebody trained in life sciences, only the branches of life sciences sort of a perspective, but we shall take a slightly different point of view, in the sense what Shinjini has already introduced, that we shall have fortnightly lectures, Saturdays by somebody from another discipline, not life sciences, and on Sunday from somebody who is working directly in a stream of the biological sciences. So we shall be bringing to you what the researchers and thinkers around the world in biology are working on. However, biology is hardly an unconnected, isolated subject. So the Saturday lectures, we hope, will also sensitize you to reflect upon biology from a not strictly biologist's point of view, because ultimately everything is connected. So to celebrate the connectedness, the first of Ant Biology webinar series' lecture is being given by none other than Professor Rajshekhar Basu, who is my colleague, and I welcome him heartily on the webinar series, and I shall be introducing him. Professor Rajshekhar Basu is a full-time faculty in the Department of History, University of Calcutta. He had previously been a faculty at the Rabindra Bharati University and Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Basu had also served as ICCR Chair in Contemporary Indian Studies at the Mycolo Romeris University, Vilnius. He was also the recipient of several international fellowships, which include Charles Wallace Fellowship, Wellcome Trust Travel Grants, Fulbright Seminar Grants, and the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute Fellowships. He has also held visiting professorships at the Heidelberg University, Tartu University, Tallinn University, Charles University, Praha, CNRS Paris, Lund University, Uppsala University, University of Marseille, and the Czech Academy of Sciences, and the University of Canterbury, Christchurch. He was also the ICCR-sponsored resource person at the Conference on Diaspora, Slavery, Migration, and Racism in Paramaribo, Suriname in 2018. He has also been the co investigator of a project sponsored by the India New Zealand Educational Council to carry out research on the health, labor, and migration in the Pacific in the 19th and 20th centuries. He has specialized in several research fields, which include Dalit history, histories, histories of migration, and the history of science and technology. He has a large number of publications in the form of monographs, edited volumes, book chapters, and articles in journals published by the leading international publishing houses like Sage, Oxford University Press, Palgrave, Macmillan, Cambridge Scholars Publishing, and Routledge. So, with that, it is our absolute honor to welcome you, Professor Basu, and we open the series with your talk, which I'm sure promises to be an extremely interesting one.
Thank you. A very good evening to all of you. First, let me put myself on record uh, by extending my gratitude to Professor Roy Banerjee, who's a very esteemed colleague of mine in the Science College campus of Baliganj, and her team for inviting me to this talk. This is really unique as I go by what Shinjini and Professor Ray Banerjee had to offer as introductory remarks. It is very interesting that that this thing is coming through because as I was discussing with Professor Ray Banerjee before we went on air, that we used to have these sort of interactions and discussions about 70, 80 years back. But suddenly, after the Indian independence and the Indian nation state taking its form, somewhere down the line, despite all talks of interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, uh, interdisciplinary linkages, we have not really in India gone that far in terms of interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity. We've just borrowed ideas here and there, whether we teach science or whether we teach humanities. And we've tried to say that, well, we are being interdisciplinary. We are not being interdisciplinary by doing all these things as we pretend to do. Uh, Rather, we need to go a long way and really search what the exact meaning of multidisciplinarity or even interdisciplinarity means. And that's where I think we have been lagging behind for over several decades, and it's only now that that university faculty, whether they are in humanities or in commerce or in sciences, we are realizing more and more that we have the exact human resources. We have the people in the university system, but we have never been in touch. And perhaps Professor Ray Banerjee needs to be congratulated because she's taken the lead and she's spoken to me a couple of times or even more about the possibility of having a person who's not really from the same discipline or from the sciences background to come and share a few ideas on a theme that has its bearings so far as scientists are concerned. Now, I begin my lecture with a bit of trepidation because I speak primarily before biologists. But nonetheless, this is an issue I think which I think biologists would also contribute in perhaps in a bigger way. And I was just talking to Professor Raymanerjee that in the West, biologists have written a lot about history of science and history of medicine. So why can't we in India think along those lines and perhaps taking a cue from very famous and very esteemed biologist Michael Bourbois? I think I'm doing the reverse as a historian to get into a biologist's domain. So thank you once again for inviting me. And but today I would essentially talk about dams, weirs, water bodies, and rivers particularly. Now, rivers have always been in our hearts. Rivers have always stirred very strong human emotions. Rivers have actually sustained civilizations. They have made a civilization gaining strength. At the same time, civilizations have declined because the river has changed its course, or there has been a lot of siltation, or there has been less water which has been flowing across the river. Now, rivers, as we all know, they very often, in course of 500 or 1,000 years, they change their course. The siltation process is also not very something very uniform. You cannot really predict the sort of the siltation formation that will take place. Neither can you talk about the new geological forms which are also coming through uh, as a part of the entire discussion on the river system. And the rivers have also been the creators or the sustainers of unique landscapes. So you cannot really remove the any discussion about the river from your mental landscape. The river is there somewhere or the other in your mental landscape. And rivers are free flowing. Earlier, they were thought that it's a product of nature, it's a gift of nature. Why do you need to actually strangulate the river? Why do you need to really strangulate the river? Why can't you let it flow as the way it flows, despite all floods, despite all inundations, despite the human misery that has been brought to by fast flowing rivers, by rivers which carry a lot of water? The, the feeling in the ancient past was that the rivers should be given their own choice to flow. But it's only in the 19th century, with the principle of commodification of water resources gaining ground, that water is not something free. It has to be taxed. It has to be used within limits. Otherwise, you can charge a heavier amount. That rivers can also actually, water bodies and rivers can also lead to revenue maximization. Now, all these ideas had a direct bearing so far as India was concerned, and primarily my discussion would be on colonial South India. Now, we find that right in the 1840s, there was this entire discussion on whether the government could actually impose a water cess. And 100 years down the line, in 1945, we find that the government of Madras, which was based in Fort St. George, actually brings about a very crucial amendment so far as the Irrigation Cess Act is concerned. Now, and we find that how does the colonial state define its control or its supervision of water bodies? It says that all the water bodies, all the water resources have to be utilized for the improvement of human beings. Now, right from the 1840s down till present times, you've been hearing about quote unquote advancement, improvement, progress, everything in the positive sense. We also development and so on, so forth. But this entire very developmentalist perspective, it came through right from the 1840s, just before the revolt of 1857, because the British were out and out trying to use these idioms as signifiers which could legitimize their political authority over alien subjects. And at the same time, after the revolt had really created a lot of problems for the Britishers, in the 1860s, we find that there is more and more talk not only of legitimacy, but also in terms of harnessing water. And harnessing not only water, but harnessing the natural resources to the level that could lead to an advancement of the Indian civilization or the South Asian civilization. And we find that there are there are plenty of reports, plenty of correspondences between the layers of the colonial bureaucracy about irrigation, about damming of rivers, about setting up of weirs, smaller dams, and uh, a lot of historians who could also qualify as development studies specialists like Elizabeth Whitcomb and Ian Stone have written extensively about colonial policy so far as irrigation was concerned, and whether these colonial policies have been beneficial or detrimental to the Indian society. Now, we also know that in the case of Punjab, there had been talk about the canal colonies, because the canal colonies, once the irrigation canals move into the dry regions of Punjab, there would be better irrigation facilities for the farmers, for the hardworking Punjabi farmers, to produce more than what they had been producing in the yesteryears. But we all know what happened with the canal colonies. In principle, it is one. In praxis, it is the other side that has come. So, with very promising beginnings, it ended up with disappointments at the end. Now, in South India also, we have regions like Tinnavelly and Nachin which is bordering Travancore area or modern day Trivandrum. And there also, we have tried to study the impact of colonialism on agricultural life, particularly when these new irrigation setups come into existence. Now, uh, even prior to the 1840s, if one goes into the early part of the 19th century, when the British were actually trying to set their feet on a farmer footing, so far as South India was concerned, they were coming up across the rural landscape, the realities of the rural landscape, as I talk about. They were noting the fact that the channels, the canals, the tanks, and the other irrigation works were really in very, very bad shape. They were not in good condition at all. And that these channels, canals, tanks, and other irrigation works were very important because they actually were the sources from which water was drawn, and they were also acting as storages of water for agriculture. And from the 1820s down till about the 1850s or 1860s, there was a great deal of talk about commissioning, so far as commissioning of new river works or river improvement works was concerned. So we find that in those days, in 1830s and 1840s, much of the river training, much of the job regarding river training, much of the job regarding river surveying, much of the job regarding this construction work on the rivers or improvement of the water bodies was actually undertaken by the government through the British, the Royal Military. So there were certain battalions within the within the company service who actually had specialized engineers as bosses. So these were the people who were pressed into service. And when you see these irrigation works down till 1860s, 70s, 80s, you cannot actually delete or omit the names of certain military officials who were not only military officials but were also qualified engineers. And particularly after 1840s and 50s, with the setting up of the Thomason College, now previously the Roorkee Engineering College, and now the IIT Roorkee. So the Thomason College, this sort of engagement of military engineers with the with the river works or with the riparian system becomes much more prominent in India. So, and the first public works department in India, so far as India is concerned, was set up in Madras in 1852. And we find that by setting up this sort of department, the colonial state felt that there would be very timely leads so far as agricultural productivity was concerned, so far as revenue extraction, so far as strengthening of revenue extraction was concerned, and so far as increasing the coffers for the royal treasury for the company's treasury was concerned. And it is from this sort of idea that we find that rivers were actually there were giant or grandeur schemes were drawn up so far as damming the rivers were concerned, and the rivers were not really allowed to flow freely as they flowed in the past. Now, whether they did much damage by reducing the quantum of the water flow compared to the previous years, when they really decided to curtail the quantum of the water flow, or whether they actually increase the prospects of further economic activity is an issue which is open to doubt, and nothing is beyond doubt, because there are groups of social scientists who would say that the damming of the rivers meant the damming of the fortunes of the Indian people. But there are social scientists who would argue that the damming of the rivers actually led to improvement. So I am a bit skeptic uh, in taking up a very clear cut position on this particular issue. But I'm more inclined to argue that the sort of damming of the rivers did have a damning effect, and it has a damning effect. Now it is very, very clear, with the sort of researches that have gone into the Tungabhadra, with the researches that have gone into the Kaveri Metro project, with the sort of researches that have come into a very close to our home terrain, the Damodar Valley Corporation. And we find that obviously there the historian would find an ally in the biologist. See how much of species we have lost. The river animals, the riverine species have been lost, and the sort of damage that has been done to the entire ecosystem centering around the river networks. So let me now get into this point of where I start off, South India. And South India, once again, when there was this talk of actually damming of rivers, utilizing water as a sort of commodity, uh, maximizing the revenue out of water resources, there was always this doubt, and this doubt would always be there. Big biologists who are working in South India also sometimes who have friends among historians, they still grapple with these issues. What are drylands and what are wetlands? Uh, can the biologist version be very different for the wetlands, and can it be very different for the drylands? Because the wetlands, as we all know, are essentially lands which get water from the rain, and there is no problem in getting water. And at the same time, they are also bordered by free flowing rivers which are more or less have water on a yearly basis. They just don't go dry during the summer months as in the drier regions. Whereas in the drier regions, which are just opposed to the rain-fed fields, water is a constraint because you don't get that much of water, and you need to get water from other sources, barring which in addition to rain. So there, I think the weirs and the dams, this entire experiment of weirs and dams started in 1850s, 1860s, keeping the drier regions into consideration. Because the colonial bureaucracy felt that if you had a good irrigation system, particularly geared for meeting the demands of the dry region, then obviously there is a scope for revenue maximization. They can have two crops a year, perhaps. You can go beyond monocropping. There is the sort of debate that is there. It goes on even into the 1880s, 1890s, and in the early part of the 19th century, when the Volcker Commission comes. There's a Royal Commission of Agriculture in India, and many biologists also have contributed. They have also read these reports as much as historians. There is this entire talk of maximization through by having irrigation works in the drier regions. So we find that once this experiment started, once this sort of debate started, then obviously you could not extricate yourself from the later day discussions, the 20th century discussions on power, on irrigation, on navigation, and flood control, dams, and so on, so forth. But one thing which also came in the 20th century, or even from the last decades of the 19th century, is that if you are erecting dams, are you preventing the free passage of migratory fish from the seas sometimes, or from other sources? And are you actually preventing the fishes from having a spawning ground? So, is it detrimental to fisheries? Is it bound to reduce the number of fishes? Is it bound to have a very adverse effect on the fish market? And at the same time, is it going to have a very, very adverse effect on the fortunes of the riverine communities who thrive through fishing? Now, these are issues which also came up in 1860s in the Midwest America, when these sort of suddenly these dams appeared, and many of the farming communities, they complained that they couldn't get the salmon anymore. The salmon doesn't reach much deeper as it used to do previously, and that there was less and less yield of salmon every year. At the same time, the damming of rivers was having a very, very detrimental effect on the conservation of wildlife. This is there. Biologists have written a lot so far as 19th century Midwest US is concerned. But we don't have those sort of writings here in India. Sadly, historians and biologists have not been doing this sort of work. And as a result, what we are now trying to sensitize ourselves by discussing these issues. We are going into the archival documents. We are going into the documents such as the reports of fisheries in Tamil Nadu, report of fisheries, annual reports on fisheries in West Bengal, and so on and so forth, to find that if there is some history behind it. But dams have been found to be indispensable. But if dams have been found to be indispensable, then there is the other side of the story. How do you create a level playing field for the fishes? How can you think about fish passes? How can you think about fish ways? Can you think about fish ladders? Can you think about redesigning of lifts and locks? And can you think about passing all sorts of prohibitory control on the sort of techniques and methods that were in vogue so far as fishing is concerned? Now, these were also a matter of paramount concern for the British in the 1860s and 1870s. And we find that these had been discussed to a great extent even in England in the 19th century, and more also in the 20th century, because there was this great deal of debate when it came to water bodies and fisheries about what is customary law and what is common law. So, does fishing will it be coming under the common law experiment? And if it comes under the common law, then what sort of rights, what sort of entitlements do the village communities have on the water bodies? Now, these are questions which have sometimes been discussed by historians, and the historians here have actually sometimes made very, very important contributions. Siva Ramakrishnan, for that matter, and Arun Agarwal, for that matter, have really talked about a lot, because they were not all of them were from history discipline. Many of them came in from anthropology, many of them came in from biology, but they really did a lot of very good work on South Asian history uh, mm, in these particular areas, which now are clubbed under environmental history. So, so while in India in the 1860s, we were studying about the prospects of fisheries, particularly when dams were this entire designing of dams, setting up of dams was gaining in importance. The main debate that is there not only in India, but it's also there, as I've been talking about, in England and in America. We need to have a transnational approach. We just don't need to see the sort of ideas that have percolated in India uh, simply as very localist concerns on the part of the colonial bureaucracy. Rather, I would say that there is a transnational perspective. And when we see the old archival records, there is this transnational perspective there, because there are reference to what is happening in England and what is happening in America. And we find that fish passes, right in the 1860s and 1870s, fish passes become a point of concern in both the US and in England. And we find that fish passes are invented. There are big names of Smith, Cale, Mallock in Great Britain. There are names of Brackett, Foster, Brewer, MacDonald in America. All of them were very famous fish pass designers. And there are also quite a number of legislations. For example, the Salmon Fisheries Acts of 1868, of 1862, and the Fisheries Act of 1868 in Scotland, and then the 1871 fisheries laws in England. And we find that there are a lot of people. For example, there is a character by the name of Frank Buckland, who is the inspector of salmon fisheries in England, and he says that fishes would just die a natural death. The species would die a natural death if you don't have fish passes. So even if people were dependent on fish as as a very important source of food or nutrients, or as a very important source of food and sustenance, at the same time people were also very conscious that you needed to conserve. And that is what I think people like Buckland tried to argue. Now, the time around 1860s, 1870s, when all these ideas were there, in 1860s, there is a British official, there is a colonial official about whom very little has been discussed in independent India. We have tended to actually always uh, think of the British Raj as oppressive, as exploitative, as and everything in terms of drain of wealth. Everything in terms of drain of wealth. We have not really visualized that there were thousands and hundreds of colonial officials who were more concerned about India than what present day Indians are concerned about India. And one of the persons in the service of the British government here in India was Sir Arthur Cotton. Cotton was born in India. He went back to England for his studies, then returned back to India. And he was knighted because he was one person who could understand the language of all the Indian rivers. Name one river where Cotton didn't visit. Cotton went to almost all these rivers, tried to study the river systems, tried to study the villages or the riverine areas, the sort of the riparian communities around the big river systems, their demands, their needs, their problems, and their hopes and aspirations, which were linked with bigger rivers like the Kaveri, the Ganga, the Mahanadi, and so on and so forth. So, and whatever we know, we as Bengalis, we always tend to find a solace in, in some Bengali writer writing something about fishes and fisheries. We have not cared to read Cotton. And Cotton in 1860s makes a very interesting, he has a very interesting proposition that why don't we invest more about about the processes leading to desiltation of the rivers. Why don't we actually think of integrating the rivers, something which was done during the regime of Jawaharlal Nehru in the 1950s, that you integrate the Ganga with the Godavari and so on and so forth, various sort of projects. Now, Cotton went beyond his official duties. Of course, of course, he was drawn to the art of revenue maximization. He was very shrewd. He knew that he understood the logic of capitalism of water. Perhaps he's father of the logic of capitalism of water in India. But Cotton was also one who pointed out that you can have a very debilitating effect if you continue to build dams in this fashion on the rivers or on the water bodies, and these dams will have a very debilitating effect on the movement of fishes. So much so that in 1860s he comes up, and in 1869 Lord Mayo commissions a doctor. He's a full-fledged doctor, Samuel Francis Day. He has every high qualifications as a physician. But Samuel Francis Day is also brought into Indian service from London, and Day is certainly he is a person who could be whom I think biologists should uh, write more about day rather than historians writing more about day. As a doctor, he was more drawn to biological sciences. He wanted to understand, he wanted to know the different species, the thousands of species of birds, animals, fishes. He was particularly interested in fishes. And it reached Lord Mayo's ears that, this doctor can be the real biologist that you're looking out for. And he is one, you give him a tenure of 2 3 years. His only job is to take a boat, ride the boat on the Indian rivers, and find out the list of fishes from the fishermen, from the local fishermen, tabulate them, write big narratives on the Mahasair, which he wrote on the Himalayan Mahasair, and so on and so forth. And it was Day who was commissioned to investigate all these big questions of whether we should actually whether we should put obstacles on the water bodies, and so on and so forth. And subsequently he became the Inspector General of Fisheries in India. And Day once again was very energetic, and he said that dams should not be put across rivers in a very indiscriminate manner, because dams act as barriers to the passage of fishes, and therefore it is very detrimental to fisheries. And also, he says that fish passes have not been correctly designed. They have not been placed in the right places. As a result, to be very simple, what Day says is, you see, there are certain fishes, as you know better than me, biologists know better than me, who have this propensity of moving up from the lower reaches to the higher reaches. Whether they do it for spawning purposes simply, or whether there are certain other instincts which are actually peculiar to those to the animal world, is something which is not always known to a historian. Perhaps the biologists know much better than what historians know in this regard. But certainly, when the dams are erected, at one point of time when they try to really move up the river, there are these obstacles, and they tend to be thrown off because there is this cascade of water which is coming over them. So they tend to be thrown off down to the lower reaches. So they might be climbing from the upper reach, from the lower reaches to the upper reaches, but after reaching a certain point of vantage where they could have easily crossed over and been to the other side of the dam, they tend to be thrown off and placed at far lower levels from where they might have started their journey. And there the fishermen are there, and they are indiscriminately slaughtered. As a result of which, many of the fishes which are laid with roe or eggs are slaughtered indiscriminately. So there is this annual depreciation in terms of the figures of fishes that abound a particular river. So Day says that if you are to take the Kaveri, you have to take the lower Anikat, the dams on the which are the lower Anikat, the smaller dams, and place those fish passes there. And he drew in a lot of ideas from Buckland's model. Now, when I looked into Samuel Francis Day's this great book, Fishes and Fisheries of India, there's a copy of this particular book. It's very torn in the National Archives of India in Delhi. I have to search the Asiatic Society of Library before making any pronouncement that we don't have a copy of it here in Calcutta. Possibly we can have a copy here in the Asiatic Society. It has to be searched. Now, Hilsa was the fish which was hmm, his point of interest. And we Bengalis, we generally tend to take up this Podda, Meghna, the Ganga Bhagirathi networks as the habitats or the habitat of the Hilsa. But the Hilsa is also available in very large numbers in the Kaveri area. And we find that Samuel Francis Day was very much concerned about this passage of the Hilsa because the Kaveri Hilsa was finding it very difficult to climb all the way from the sea down to the other side of the dam, and they were being indiscriminately slaughtered. As a result, the price of fishes in the Madras market or in the Madurai market, these two important towns, was increasing rapidly. So he was having the sort of the chart so far as the price chart of fishes were concerned in both Madras and Madurai, and he comes to this conclusion that, see, the prices what they were in the 1850s is no more close to that range. Rather, they are exorbitantly high in the 1860s and 1870s, and it is all because the hilsa and the other fishes which have had this propensity to move up the dam have not been able to do so, and they have been killed. Now, this entire, Samuel Francis Day's observations on the rivers, because he's just not tied to South India. He also goes into the United Provinces, present in UP. He is one who goes to Orissa. He is one who goes to Punjab, because every one of them have this grand vision about the Mahasair, the Himalayan Mahasair, and so on and so forth. So, and they also, many of their experiments are actually tried out in Haridwar and Dehradun, so as to say. So, fish pass, whether you can have a fish pass in Cuttack, whether you can have a fish ladder at Haridwar, or whether you can have some ideas from the secretary of the Dehradun Fisheries Association, whether these fish ladders will be operative in places in upland areas like Bhimgoda or Majapur, where the northern Ganges canals take off. These are matters which have continued to excite Samuel Francis Day and many of the military engineers of the Royal Battalions. And certainly in the 1940s, we had people like Hamid Khan of Undivided India, who studied this entire debate on fish ladders in the Punjab. Now, as a result, we find that not only the fish pass, not only there are disagreements over the construction of fish pass, the location of the fish pass, and so on and so forth, and the entire logic of having a fish pass, and how is it possible to actually correlate this very concept of fish passes with the concerns of hydraulic engineering, which are there in the late 19th and early 20th century. Apart from that, we have we have a lot of debate that is coming in so far as methods or strategies that are quite common within the fishing communities of India. So Samuel Francis Day, he reports his big report is in his big report that fishes are also indiscriminately slaughtered through very devious methods. You have a large number of nets. There are different types of nets which are used, and there are also chemicals or poisons which are used. And this is very peculiar to the Indian scene. Apart from the entire debate on whether the colonial state can actually intervene so far as fisheries are concerned or a river is concerned by imposing their will, because it goes against the principle of common law as it operates in some parts of India. But right till the early part of the 20th century, there have been series of papers written in America and Canada. I mean North America, which is the main area where primarily biologists have written about dams and the problems of migratory fishes. And we need to really seriously look into these sort of research projects that were carried out right from the 1920s down till the 1940s. And the American Society of Ichthyologists, which had its base in Stanford University, was one of those particular organizations which actually went into this entire business of preservation of fish. Now, so far as Kaveri and Bittur is concerned, so Kaveri was the large storage reservoir was decided to be built at Mettur in 1910. And this was also the time when the Madras Fisheries Department was in its infancy. It was sanctioned by the Secretary of State in 1924, and the Fisheries Department was not really consulted. It did not have that much of teeth, and as a result, it was all the engineers. Now, even people like Vishweshwaraya, for that matter, were involved with this Mature experiment so much as also the British engineers who were affiliated to the irrigation department. I don't think a biologist was concerned. a biologist's opinion was taken into consideration at that length of time. And we find that that Kaveri is undoubtedly one of those large rivers which could vie with the Krishna in South India. And the Kaveri flows past many of these ancient towns like Tanjore or Thanjavur. And we also find that there are also uh, mm, you know waterfalls on the Kaveri, for that matter, from the upland areas. For example, people know about the Shiva Samudram waterfalls, and actually the river actually mm, uh, it goes through a gradient. Actually, it comes down a descent of 320 feet. So that makes the river look like a waterfall in the Madras Presidency. And the Siva Samudram falls are a barrier, are a complete barrier to the ascent of fish. So there is this dam. And we find that once the Mittur Dam is constructed, there is this huge hundreds of miles on the river which is affected, because you might have water for irrigation, but now you are also in the risk of getting less and lesser number of water species. So as a result, we find that there is a lot of talk about the improvement that Mittur can bring. Not first is irrigation, second is power. But nobody in the Mittur, so far as the reports on the Mittur project is concerned, nobody has written about what happens to these animals, what happens to these species. And we find that a lot of people who were in the fisheries department, they were of course biologists, but they were Sarkari officials. They were very much officials of the government, like the Zoological Survey of India and so on and so forth. But these people used to work with the fisheries department, these biologists, and these biologists say that it is just not Hilsa that we are going to study. We also have to study the Katla, which was somehow the other introduced into the reservoir system here in South India, and we have to see how these particular fishes are affected. Now, the fishes are affected because the biologists feel that even if you had a smaller dam, perhaps they could have still survived. But if you have very large masonry constructions like the Mittur Dam, it is impossible for them to climb up. It is impossible for them to survive. So as a result, all of them they tend to accumulate down in the lower slopes. They rarely have no opportunity so far as their reproductive behavior is concerned, or for their other instincts to go up the river. Now this is going against nature. Now, why is it important for a historian and a biologist to talk about these? It is necessary because we need to have a survey of the fishery resources of the various river systems, which we don't have in India. We need to have a picture of a picture of the developments before the dams were built and the picture after the dams were built. We need to study these old records to know that to have exact information about the seasons and occasions when mass migration of fishes have occurred in various rivers. They are different from one another. The mass migration is different from one another so far as rivers are concerned. Then this could help us in the analysis of random samples to determine the kinds, the sizes and conditions of fishes which congregate at the dam. Why do they congregate? Why do they congregate at the opening of the sluices? And why do they migrate at all? These are issues, I think, which should make biologists and historians very emotional, that we have not been doing all these things for years. And even if we have been doing it, we have been doing it from our very, very narrow disciplinary and backgrounds. And this is what Professor Ray Banerjee was referring to. Now, we find that it is that when we study the Colonial, which is a tributary of the Kaveri, on which the Betur project has been built, uh, we find that there is a great reference to the Katla, which is stocked annually in the Betur reservoir. Since the formation of the reservoir and the reduction in the height has been able to allow these fishes to ascend the falls. So in some cases they have been able to go beyond the falls, and there are species of fishes which are referred. For example, the Sirhina cirrhosa, the Mystius aor, the Mystius singhala, the Labio fimbriatus. Now, they say that these fishes continuously facing problems so far as ascending the river is concerned, or ascending the dams are concerned. And every year at the same time, fishermen complain before these biologists who are attached to the fisheries department that the fishes are rather inadequate. Their catch is small compared to the previous years, and and they say that they really cannot define the exact season when these fishes will appear in the river systems. I think we are facing the same sort of situation even till today, when certain fishes are certainly going out of our palate because we don't find those fishes anymore. Rather, it is the off-season variety that comes in, and whether we don't know whether they are caught right now or whether they have been preserved in the cold storages, and they've been lying there for 2 years or so. Now, fishes generally tended to, but the debates generally bring out these sides of the story. Fishes generally congregate at the dam whenever water is let down, and there seems to be no particular reason for their migration. A repeated analysis of the samples showed that all the 14 species, except the burrell, the spiny eel, and the true eel, are attracted in large numbers by the flowing water in the part of the Ellis Canal system, which is where there are both high and low level sluice channels. These fishes assemble, and they are in relative abundance throughout the year. Also, fish of all sizes are found, adult fish, however, being very few. At times, some have ripe eggs and flowing milk. It is therefore clear that these migrations are not really for that much for breeding so much as for the dispersal of the species. So the debates bring out these sides of the story. Perhaps the biologists would be able to answer more clearly than a historian. Now, we find that that mature actually has also led to absolute absence of certain species. There is a permanent rise in the level of water, there is submergence of rocks and banks, and there is accumulation of silt in the bed of the river reservoir. These have their resultant changes. Prawns are directly affected. Prawns like to live on the sandy beds and weedy banks, and they have totally disappeared. A gradual extinction of species which do not survive in stagnant waters, and their replacement by fish adapted to such conditions of life, is an inevitable part of this process. And we find that whatever they were writing in the late 19th century, early part of the 20th century, they would say that a lot of things, a lot of developments would take place in the future. So the future holds good for the people in the knowledge industry, because so many new varieties of fishes could come in. But at the same time, heavy floods, rapid currents do also have an impact on the lives of the fishes. Fishes of all kinds are not really geared, they are not in a position to survive in these sort of situations. And some of them are no longer able to dig deep or take shelter in the deep pools. Some of them might be blown away by the gush of water. And we find that these deep pools are no more deep pools. They are also being covered with sand and silt. As a result, the entire breeding process of the fishes is affected. Now, this is a loss. This is a loss to mankind, and it is a loss to the natural world. The colonial officials would make us believe that these are losses so far as fisheries are concerned. But these are grave losses, or these spell a disaster to our ecosystem. We and just because we didn't have people to work on the biologists, historians, and anthropologists like in the US to work on the Columbia River, we are not able to assess the damage that has been caused because of the Kaveri Metro project. Had we had a project like the Columbia River in the US or the Grand Coulee Dam, we could have assessed it further. We could have done a very good comparative story. But that is not there. And we now, what we are now, we would like to end this entire debate or discussion by saying that yes, water is getting scarce. The logic with which the dams were built, the sort of great advantage of the big dam system, has been lost in the 1960s and 1970s. Environmentalists, biologists, social activists, development specialists have all argued that rather than giving water to mankind, dams have robbed mankind of the supply of water. It has made water more scarce in the rivers, and as a result, the species, the fishes have declined. The number of species have declined. Many have gone into extinction. No more you have the communities are able to sustain themselves. Those particular human communities who live by the side of the riparian systems are able to sustain their lives. So there are long charts, there are long reports, there are equally very copious volumes of statistics on the river systems, and they all give details about the administrative part of the story. There are sometimes the social aspect of the side of the story resulting from this curious relationship between dam building and its impact on fisheries. And I think we we are now in a situation where we need to take up these studies in a far more serious earnest than ever before, because as we are now going down into this entire philosophy of the end of the world, perhaps there should be more discussion not only on human beings but our friends, the carp, the catfish, the Himalayan Mahasair, and so on and so forth, to understand what they also feel in a sort of a globalized world. And the globalized world is just not the 1991 globalized world, the process of globalization that had started in South Asia. Even British rule is a part of the globalizing world, and this sort of globalizing instinct and the sort of relations that the natural world has with the human world is a matter which should bring the biologists and the historians on a common platform. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for this
Hello.
such an interest.
একটু পরে একটা ওয়েবিনারে আছি, একটু পরে।
Thank you so much for this very interesting lecture, and so interesting to know how the aquatic wildlife is so threatened by the dams. So, sir, there is one question till now. So, if you allow, I can just ask it. So, other than dams, poor water quality also acts as a barrier, especially in case of Indian rivers like the Ganges. So, from a historian's perspective, how water pollution has shaped the aquatic ecosystem?
Well, of course, yes, because it's just not siltation. It's also we never had this problem before. At least 120 years back or 125 years back, so far as the the Ganges was concerned, we didn't have this problem. But now, in 100 years' time, we have so many of chemical industries lined up in the towns which are adjacent to the Ganges, and also a large number of towns which don't have a proper sanitation facilities, and which would rather the excreta would rather end up in the river, leading to the pollution of the river from the human excreta. So these are problems of very rapid and desperate urbanization, sort of a jungle urbanization. So this is also a problem which has affected the water animals, the aquatic species, so as to say. And for example, Varanasi. If one takes a Samuel Francis Day's concerns of 1860s and early 1870s, when he was doing this sort of investigative work, um, he would mention the river otter, which was there. But now, if you go down to Varanasi and if you speak to the boatmen, in the last 50, 60 years, how many times have people cited the river otter? It's a rare sight if you just happen to see it. So, and you also have the dwindling numbers of river dolphins, so as to say. So definitely, this sort of water pollution is giving rise to a new system altogether, where the putrid atmosphere is is definitely driving away the animals or killing them. We don't really know. As a result of which, this could also be taken as a very, very important source of debilitation when it comes to our discussion today, because this is a later day. I think, as a historian, I would say that it's a later day problem. It's a problem which did not exist when Samuel Francis Day or the other colonial bureaucrats were looking into these particular issues. But it is only now that for the last 50, 60 years, we have also the Ganga Pollution Board, the Ganga cleaning up projects, and so on and so forth in Varanasi, burning of corpses on the river banks, throwing away parts of the corpses into the rivers. These are all matters which have come in the 1980s. Perhaps they should have been here before towns like Kannauj, before towns like Varanasi became much more disparate in terms of urban dwelling. But that's another issue altogether.
Okay, so another question is, like, we heard that dams can be detrimental to the species fish. Can it also be effective in the generation of new fish species?
Well, that is a that's a real tricky side. The conventional fishes which used to go up, which used to have a free movement across the river from the southern reaches to the northern reaches. Well, of course, they have faced problems, but there are also equal references that new varieties of fishes have appeared. And by new varieties of fishes, we really don't know whether they were denizens of the past, whether they were not really counted that much, or under the new sort of geological or engineering technicalities they have emerged. We don't really know about it, but certainly there is every possibility that new generation of species with greater instincts of survival, or with a greater agenda of survival, they might have come and they might have settled in the rivers. But that might not. But that doesn't really rule out the loss or the extinction. The loss that is coming from extinction.
And another question is that colonization has introduced a lot of new species, some of which are invasive. Is there any data about effect of the dams on these non-native or invasive fishes over the period of time?
Well, there is a well, for the Madras Presidency, we have Nicholson's report. Who was the director of the fisheries, very famous Nicholson. Some of these fishes which were introduced into India, possibly from Africa. There are some references that they were used. They were just thrown into the drains or into the soak pits to eat up the larva. And these were some of those new fishes which were being introduced. There is some bit of data on this, but so far as the rivers were concerned, we really don't have much data on the introduction. The British didn't really much write on the introduction of new fishes. So there we don't have. But so far as the urban the local municipal or the local municipal department was concerned, we have certain data that some of these new varieties of fishes were being used to eat up the larvae of the mosquitoes, and this was one of those particular experiments which was favored by even people like Nicholson to keep away the incidence of malaria, which really raged high so far as colonial South India was concerned.
Okay, so another question from Bijay is, what would be the best strategy that we can adopt to mitigate these problems so that we can maintain a sustainable aquatic ecosystem along with sustainable development?
Now, this is a very complicated question to answer. One of the ways I think which is being suggested in America and Europe is to break down the dams. And there have been some very good dividends so far as this entire policy of breaking down dams and weirs are concerned in both Europe and in North America, and trying to make the rivers free so far as their flow is concerned. Now, this is one of the ways I think you can bring back to some extent the lost ecosystem, because by this time the ecosystem that is there is something. It's a matter of adaptability. It might have come because of the new set of circumstances. You cannot really go back to the old, and you cannot say that everything is old. There is nothing called old. So there must have been a past before the old as well. So but to have a modicum of sustainable aquatic ecosystem, we need to have, first of all, a thorough audit of the irrigation works that have been there since the British times down till present times, and to see how much of human interests are served through dams and weirs rather than misery, the degree of misery. And it's only then that when we take the human misery into consideration, we also take the income level or the penury and the poverty levels of the communities which are dependent on fisheries or on fishes. So once we see their dwindling incomes, that is also a part which is linked to the ecosystem, to the ecosystem that has been generated because of the dams and weirs. So if we have a proper audit, then only we can really say that whether we really have any purpose to do, we would have any purpose to do by breaking open the dams. But I believe that should have been the case, but rather, yeah, contrary prevails.
So that is all the question that we have. So I would now request Professor Renare Banerjee to come in and address.
Thank you, Shinjini. I was sitting glued to the laptop. Such an interesting discussion, Professor Basu. It was so enjoyable, and so the one thing that I find very intriguing through all that riveting discussion is that how much of different disciplines seem to be tied in together. So there is the hydrological forces in play. So people with completely different kinds of trainings would like to assess that, because the water bodies would be very, very different as far as the component of the water is concerned, the flow is concerned, all the climatic forces. Then the engineers who construct bridges or dams or fish passes. Then the ecologists who actually study, people like us, zoologists and botanists and microbiologists who study the planktons and the bacteria and the macrofauna and the flora. Then the policy that governs. So the most recent disaster in Uttarakhand, with the explosion of the glacier, lots of narratives are being spun that this went wrong and that went wrong. I think to preempt such disasters, a systems study is necessary. And I think your last comment very nicely sort of sums it up, is that the audit has to be done by people who are experts in different disciplines, and then it has to be tied together into the policies for development, economy, laws, the codes of conduct that govern us, our responsibilities and our rights. So we come back to the Constitution. We have just celebrated our Republic Day, and we come back to that. So it is so interdisciplinary, and so many things are tied up. And while I was listening to your very interesting and detailed talk, I couldn't help thinking that when one writes a scientific paper, one is limited to certain areas, because a certain kind of journal would like to publish that. And so the data and the inferences from the data are done in a very specific way, because that discipline, that journal demands that of you.
Exactly.
However, a historical journal or a social sciences journal would be more verbose, and the narratives would be more qualitative. And that is so important, I think, when we look at science only from a very narrow scientific perspective. And like you said, science should be, more, the word should be used in more of a, philosophical connotation of the thing, rather than just the disciplines and what it demands. So I think that audit, what you just said, also takes ought to take in expertise of, say, climatologists, and then social scientists, the culture, the practices of the people that directly contributes to public health issues. And I think the whole thing ties up to probably the greatest challenge that is facing us today, which is water security and food security as a sustainable and renewable adhar, like we say, of the life that sustains it and that we use as food. So I think we might also talk a little bit about the funding and the kind of grants that could be written over it in a completely interdisciplinary format. And
Exactly.
I think the government, international and national funding agencies, is also encouraging, for example, in skill development projects or in problem solving projects. It is being encouraged increasingly that a consortium style collaboration between different institutes and with people with different disciplines and different skills come
Exactly.
together to solve a problem. So would you like to comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. Both in principle or in terms of academic engagement, I think Professor Ray Banerjee's venture, I think, should be taken with a great deal of seriousness. And I believe that as I began my discussion today, alluding to the same point or the same platform that we should be in, I think we should now think of our projects, despite our disciplinary and constraints, our boundaries. We need to talk more across disciplines, and in future, we design some research projects, because as we know, as professors in the university, sometimes we apply, we don't get funds. The project is rejected. Some funding agency doesn't find it that interesting, or it is beyond their purview. But at times there are also international agencies which are able to accommodate this very logic that there would be biologists, there would be historians, there would be anthropologists and sociologists and development specialists together. So, and I think these sort of projects are very essential, because it also helps to train our students who are very cocoonized. Either they are cocoonized within the labs or in their classrooms in the science faculty or in the humanities faculty. They don't seem to know each other in terms of social communication as well. And of course, when these projects come, I think we are also able to experiment more, because we are able to talk to one another much more closely, much more intensely than what we had in the past, and also try to evolve some new methodological strategies which we have never utilized before. and also some new ways of doing things uh, at the field level. So I think a historian could also be energized to come out of the armchair existence and made to work in the field by a biologist or an anthropologist in their own way. So I think this is very, very essential, and I think Professor Ray Banerjee, if she takes a bit of leap forward, we are there to jump the extra mile for her. We will definitely be there.
Absolutely. I think the choice-based credit system that we have already introduced in our undergraduate and postgraduate studies aims to do exactly that. And I think we can take the baby steps by little internships across different disciplines, so that one can get out of that comfort zone, and that extra push that they are anyway doing for scoring the required
Mhm.
marks for the CBCS, and they can actually get some more training on it, understand the subject a little better than the core subject in which they are training. So,
Exactly.
on that note, I think we have had a very interesting Saturday evening. Thank you so much, Professor Boshu, for giving us
Thank
the
you very
time and
much.
for answering the
Thank
questions so nicely. And thanks to the audience who has stayed with us. I think during the new normal, we were all forced to stay indoors, and we had a better live viewership. But in this format, more questions come in later as people revisit the archive
you.
talks. And so we might share some of the questions that come in later. I
Of
hope
course.
we can take this beyond this, webinar, and take it to actual fruition of a project of, policy, long-term policy that
Exactly.
actually affects us. So it is important to look back into the past, and who better than a historian to, give these little snippets to tie together into a, comprehensive narrative. So
Thank you
thank you
very
so
much.
much. And thanks to our moderator, Shinjini, and our
Yeah, thanks to
host,
Shinjini and the
Nondita.
entire team.
Uh, yes, and Akashlina, and Bijoy, and Shoheli, and everybody else who has asked such interesting questions and made our lecture so very interactive. So, with that, we end tonight's talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Shinjini, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you everyone
So
for
you have to
joining.
repeat that.
Yes, yes,
You have to repeat the entire
yes, ma'am.
last bit.
So thank you, ma'am. And thank you everyone for joining. Join us tomorrow for a lecture by Dr. Srinivas V. Kaveri of INSERM Paris. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and check out our website www.zoologyhub.org. Our talks will be archived in our YouTube channel, so you can check them out later. And thank you again for joining us. Take care and see you again tomorrow.